hung in the balance against a colossal empire. Britain, with its elite soldiers, powerful fleets, and control of strategic ports, loomed over the American colonies like an unbreakable force. In those early days, defeat was constant, and every skirmish seemed to echo the vast power gap between Britain and the ragtag Continental Army. Yet, even in the darkest moments, a spark of resilience flickered. "These are the times that try men's souls," wrote Thomas Paine in The American Crisis, rallying American hearts and spirits with words that became as powerful as any weapon. Paine's words breathed courage into soldiers and citizens alike, reminding them that this was a battle for something much greater than land. It was for the soul of freedom itself. For the Continental Army, every confrontation was a test of strength, a clash of wills against impossible odds. General George Washington led a force often short on supplies, training, and even basic essentials, pitted against one of the world's most formidable armies. Yet, despite these hardships, they persevered. Washington's troops were not just fighting battles, they were fighting to define the future. As we explore their journey, we'll uncover the relentless struggles and the unwavering hope that drove these men forward through unspeakable trials. Welcome to episode 3 of my series on the American Revolutionary War. I'm Sophie, and together we're stepping back in time to experience the intense highs and lows of this extraordinary chapter of American history. In this episode, we'll explore the struggles and strategy of 1776 to 1777, a period marked by hardship, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of independence. We'll dive into the turning points, those pivotal moments that would soon begin to shift the course of this epic struggle and set the stage for a nation's fight for freedom. In August of 1776, the British Empire set its sights on New York, a city poised to become the beating heart of the American Revolution. For General William Howe, capturing New York wasn't just a tactical move, it was a decisive blow aimed at splitting the rebellious colonies in two. From his perspective, New York was more than a bustling port. It was a key, a point of vital importance to the success of our cause, as he once stated. Its strategic position along the Hudson River granted control over crucial communication and supply lines, creating a wedge between the northern and southern colonies. Howe's strategy was as bold as it was ruthless, leveraging Britain's unmatched military power to crush the American rebellion quickly and efficiently. The British forces assembled for this operation were nothing short of a juggernaut. Over 32,000 highly trained soldiers, bolstered by an imposing naval fleet, descended upon New York with an intimidating display of force. For the American forces, facing an army of this scale was a daunting experience. The sheer sight of British ships filling the harbour and the rhythmic march of red-coated troops unnerved even the bravest soldiers. The British, convinced of their superiority, anticipated a swift victory that would shatter the colonists' resolve and put an end to the rebellion in one decisive stroke. Little did they know, the flames of resistance would only grow stronger. On the other side of the battlefield, General George Washington Washington understood the gravity of the situation. Despite the overwhelming odds, he resolved to defend New York, clinging to a hope that his ragtag Continental Army might hold the line. Washington knew that his soldiers, many of them farmers, shopkeepers, and labourers, lacked the experience and discipline of British regulars. Still, he had faith in their courage and was determined to make a stand. His strategy was to fortify Brooklyn Heights and use the natural defences of the area to compensate for their limited resources. It was a risky plan, but Washington knew that a retreat without a fight would crush the morale of his troops and the American people. Yet, in the Battle of Long Island, the British proved their might with brutal efficiency. Employing a clever flanking manoeuvre, Howe's troops outsmarted the Americans, encircling them and dealing a devastating blow. Washington's forces suffered significant losses, with men captured, wounded, or killed in the chaos. Among those caught in the onslaught was General Sterling, who fought valiantly, but ultimately fell to the British advance. The defeat was as painful as it was sobering. Washington watched as his soldiers, outmatched and overwhelmed, struggled against a well-oiled military machine, one that showed no mercy in its pursuit of victory. Amid the despair, however, came a moment of remarkable resilience and fortune. As night fell, Washington orchestrated a retreat from Brooklyn Heights, a daring and delicate manoeuvre that seemed doomed to fail. But fate had other plans. A dense fog rolled over the East River, concealing the movements of the Continental Army as they slipped past the British forces undetected. Boat after boat carried soldiers across the river to safety, with Washington himself among the last to leave. Reflecting on the miraculous escape, he later wrote, "The hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this." It was a retreat, yes, but a retreat that felt like a victory, a testament to the will to survive against all odds. In the wake of this narrow escape, Washington's spirit faltered. Haunted by the loss and the narrowness of their escape, he confessed, "I think the game is pretty near up." It was a rare moment of vulnerability, a glimpse into the toll this struggle was taking on him. Yet, despite his despair, Washington continued to lead, determined to find a way to fight on. His resilience, his sheer refusal to surrender, would prove crucial in the months to come, as the Continental Army braced for even harsher trials. With New York under British control, the city transformed into a bastion for British forces, a nerve centre from which they launched raids and dispatched scouts, keeping the surrounding colonies under constant threat. They fortified their positions, turning the city into a heavily guarded stronghold. For the British, New York was a prized asset, a place to plan, prepare, and strike at the heart of the American resistance. Life under British occupation brought hardship and fear to the civilians left in the city. Food became scarce as the British requisitioned supplies for their troops, leaving the local population to fend for themselves. Property was seized, homes were repurposed, and anyone suspected of sympathising with the Patriots faced harassment or worse. For New Yorkers, survival meant navigating a precarious existence, caught between loyalty and survival. Tensions simmered between those loyal to the crown and those secretly aligned with the revolutionary cause, each side viewing the other with with suspicion. In this charged environment, espionage flourished. Patriots and loyalists alike engaged in acts of sabotage, covertly gathering intelligence or striking against one another. Among the most famous of these spies was Nathan Hale, a young schoolteacher who volunteered to infiltrate British lines. Captured during his mission, Hale was sentenced to death, and his final words before his execution became legendary. "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Hale's sacrifice became a symbol of American courage and commitment, inspiring those who continued the fight. With New York firmly in British hands and the Continental Army suffering from heavy losses, the future looked bleak. Yet, Washington refused to abandon the cause. He knew that the road ahead would be grueling, marked by more hardships and bitter winters. In the coming months, his leadership would be tested like never before, as he and his men faced the bitter cold and crushing scarcity at Valley Forge. The trials of battle had been harsh, but it was at Valley Forge that the real test of endurance would begin. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge is remembered as one of the most harrowing chapters in the American Revolutionary War, a time that tested the very spirit of the Continental Army. As the icy winds swept through Pennsylvania, thousands of Washington's soldiers huddled together in makeshift huts, enduring bitter, cold, hunger, and illness with an unyielding sense of purpose. Supplies were painfully scarce, the morale dwindling as snow piled high, and freezing temperatures locked the camp in an unforgiving grip. Many of these men, reduced to mere shadows of themselves, had no boots or blankets, leaving their bare, bleeding feet to press into the frozen ground. They wrapped whatever rags they could scavenge around frostbitten toes and fingers, though it was little defence against the relentless chill. For these soldiers, life at Valley Forge was a daily struggle against death itself. Disease ravaged the camp, with dysentery, pneumonia, and smallpox spreading mercilessly through the ranks. The crude shelters they had fashioned from logs and mud offered little warmth, and inside each hut, soldiers lay weak, shivering, and feverish. An estimated 2,500 would not survive the winter, succumbing to illness that swept through the camp like wildfire. One surgeon, Dr. Albergens Waldo, famously remarked, "You might have tracked the army from White Marsh to Valley Forge by the blood of their feet." His words captured the haunting reality of soldiers' suffering, their steps marked by bloody prints in the snow, each one a testament to the quiet endurance that came to define the Continental Army. While his men languished, Washington fought a different battle of his own, one of desperate appeals and fierce loyalty to his cause. He wrote countless letters to Congress, pleading for food, clothing, and medicine, begging for the support his soldiers so desperately needed. His frustration was palpable as he struggled against bureaucratic inaction, forced to face the cruel truth that the fledgling government lacked the resources or, at times, the will to meet his requests. Washington's words grew increasingly urgent, yet often went unanswered, leaving him to rely on his own ingenuity and the sparse generosity of local supporters. Washington's presence among the men, however, was a balm in the bleakness. In every sense, he lived a relative comfort of nearby quarters to endure the same hardships they faced. Each day he walked among the tents and huts, speaking with his men, reassuring them, giving what little hope he could muster. His stoic resolve served as an anchor in the face of despair, earning him a loyalty that no decree or order could command. Washington's patience and steadfast belief in the cause kept his men united, preventing an army on the verge of disintegration from breaking. Then, just when hope seemed a distant memory, a new figure emerged at Valley Forge. In February 1778, a seasoned Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived, bringing with him a fresh wave of possibility. Von Steuben took one look at the battered army and saw its potential. He saw men, raw and untrained, yearning for leadership, and he knew he could help mould them into a force capable of withstanding the British juggernaut. The rough beginnings at Valley Forge did not daunt him, rather they emboldened him. Von Steuben immediately set to work, instilling discipline with a blend of military precision and genuine encouragement. The training regimen he devised was rigorous, and the troops responded with newfound vigour. They drilled in formation, learning to march in step, to move as one body, a vital skill for any successful army. Von Steuben introduced bayonet techniques that would later become instrumental in battle, turning raw recruits into soldiers who could hold their ground under the harshest conditions. He spoke no English, yet his presence communicated authority and belief in the men's capacity to transform. Often, he would shout commands in a blend of French and German, with curses in any language he could muster, which was then translated by his aides to bemused but willing soldiers. Alongside his practical instruction, von Steuben drafted a manual, a blueprint of discipline and tactics that would become the foundation for the US Army's training protocols. He crafted his teachings to suit the unique needs of the Continental Army, recognizing that these men were fighting for more than pay or glory. They were fighting for a new nation's freedom. This army, he proclaimed with confidence, will make the British pay for the suffering they inflicted on us. Von Steuben's presence and dedication transformed the ragged men into a formidable fighting force, instilling pride and a hardened determination. By the time the snows melted and spring arrived, the Continental Army was unrecognisable. They were no longer the weary, desperate soldiers who had limped into Valley Forge months before. They marched in formation, their bayonets gleaming in the sun, moving with precision and purpose. Washington looked upon them with pride. They had endured the harshest winter and emerged stronger, their transformation a testament to resilience and their leaders' belief in them. With von Steuben's training, these soldiers were now prepared to stand toe-to-toe with the British, their spirits renewed and their skills sharpened. Valley Forge had become not just a winter camp, but a crucible of American strength. Washington's leadership had not merely kept his army intact, it had moulded it into something altogether new, something capable of carrying the hopes of a nation. His example fortified the army's spirit, teaching them that sacrifice, unity, and unbreakable resolve were their strongest weapons. To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lie on, submitting without a murmur, he he later reflected, struck by their unwavering patience and obedience. In these men, Washington saw the seeds of a free nation, even as they stood on the edge of survival. The legacy of Valley Forge would live on in the hearts of these soldiers, a symbol of the extraordinary grit and fortitude that defined the American Revolution. The hardships they bore, the sacrifices they made, and the resilience they discovered would fuel their fight in the months and years to come. They were no longer just an army. They were a brotherhood forged in suffering, bound by the relentless pursuit of liberty. But Washington knew that skill alone would not win the war. As spring turned to summer, he recognized that traditional battlefield tactics had proven costly, that meeting the British head-on risked the destruction of all they had built. The time had come for a new approach, one as unconventional as the dream they fought for. In the shadowed woods and winding rivers of the American colonies, a new kind of warfare was taking shape. By 1776, Washington's army had endured a string of brutal defeats, from the loss at Long Island to the British occupation of New York. Traditional combat against the well-trained, well-supplied British forces had proven devastating, exposing the Continental Army's vulnerabilities and lack of resources. The British marched in lines, drums beating, bayonets flashing, an intimidating show of force. Washington's army, by contrast, was a mismatched collection of farmers and craftsmen, spirited but unseasoned, many fighting with little more than muskets and resolve. Realizing the futility of meeting the British on their terms, Washington began to reconsider his strategy. He knew his soldiers couldn't win by conventional means, but perhaps they could turn their weaknesses into strengths. So, Washington adapted. Rather than face the British head-on, he embraced guerrilla tactics that could strike at the heart of the enemy's weaknesses. Ambushes, night raids, and targeted assaults on supply lines became the new tools of the Continental Army. The terrain was an ally. Dense forests, rivers, and swamps provided ideal cover for surprise attacks and swift retreats. This approach was unorthodox, even risky, but it was also Washington's best chance to keep his army intact and keep the British unsettled. His men were learning to vanish into the trees, to reappear when least expected, to fight as shadows. We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again, said Nathaniel Greene, capturing the spirit of an army that refused to stay down. This new strategy was one of resilience and relentless disruption, aimed at frustrating and exhausting the British forces wherever they dared to tread. Few men exemplified these tactics as boldly as Francis Marion, the so-called swamp fox of South Carolina. Marion was a master of the hit-and-run style of warfare, using his intimate knowledge of the swampy backcountry to strike at British patrols, then melt back into the wilderness. His familiarity with every river bend and forest path allowed him to harass the British with near impunity. To the enemy, Marion was an elusive phantom, appearing without warning, wreaking havoc, and vanishing before they could mount a defence. Marion's small band of men became legendary for their nighttime raids, ambushing British troops, seizing supplies, and disrupting vital communications. Every time they struck, they reminded the British that the Americans were not beaten. They were watching, waiting, and ready to pounce. Marion's successes inspired other leaders within the Continental Army to adopt similar guerrilla methods. The British, accustomed to orderly rows of soldiers and predictable battlefields, found themselves facing an enemy that attacked from all sides. Guerrilla tactics forced them to divert resources to protect their supply lines, stretching their already thin forces across a vast, hostile landscape. Each shipment of British food or ammunition became a tempting target, each isolated patrol an opportunity. Night after night, the Americans struck, in the quiet of a campfire or the shadows of a supply convoy. British soldiers, who once marched with confidence, began to dread the possibility of ambush around every corner. The constant harassment had a profound impact on British operations and morale. Frustration grew among British commanders, who found their forces bogged down, unable to secure their positions or even sleep soundly. Aware that their enemy lurked unseen, British soldiers were forced to guard every movement with caution, knowing that any misstep could invite sudden, bloody conflict. The British found themselves in a battle not just against men, but against an entire landscape that seemed to conspire against them. Forests, rivers, and even the night itself became allies of the Continental Army, sheltering the Americans as they struck from hidden places. Over time, the British came to realise that this guerrilla warfare was not merely a passing nuisance, it was a genuine threat to their control. They had arrived expecting to quash a simple rebellion with shows of power and precision. But now, as resources were drained and soldiers' spirits were worn down by constant vigilance, it became clear that victory would not come easily. The Americans' unconventional approach had proven that the British couldn't secure dominance through traditional military means alone. Each attack, every ambush, was a reminder that America's vast, rugged terrain and its determined fighters would not be subdued. But as much as Washington valued guerrilla tactics, he understood that he needed a decisive moment, a victory that could reignite the hopes of his army and rally support among his countrymen. The scattered successes of the guerrilla campaigns were essential, but they weren't enough to turn the tide. Washington knew that his army needed more than just resilience and cunning. They needed to show the world, and perhaps even themselves, that they could triumph against the might of the British Empire. So, as winter's chill settled over the Delaware River, he began to lay plans for an audacious, high-stakes attack that would catch his enemy off guard and revive the struggling spirit of his revolution. The winter of 1776 brought darkness and doubt into the American cause. The Continental Army was battered, demoralised, and outmatched by the British forces that had taken New York and forced Washington's troops into retreat. By December, many believed the revolution was on its last legs. Washington, however, had other plans. Despite his army's setbacks, he saw an opportunity for a bold strike, a chance to reignite the flames of rebellion. On Christmas night, under cover of darkness and the bitter bite of a winter storm, Washington would make a daring move across the icy Delaware River to launch a surprise attack on the unsuspecting Hessian forces stationed at Trenton. choked with ice, the waters treacherous, and the night bitterly cold. Row by row, Washington's men loaded into flat-bottomed boats, their breaths visible in the frigid air as they gritted their teeth against the chill. The boats creaked and groaned as they cut through the ice, the current threatening to sweep them downstream with every pull of the oars. Washington stood at the helm, steadfast and resolute, his determination casting a quiet strength over his weary men. His password for the mission was simple yet potent: victory or death. Those words captured the stakes of the night's gamble, a reminder that failure was not an option if they hoped to sustain the revolution. Through sheer determination, they made it to the opposite shore, soaked and freezing, but ready. The hour was late, and the Hessians in Trenton had celebrated Christmas with food and drink, their guard lowered in the comfort of the holiday. Washington's men advanced silently, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the snow. In the early dawn, as the first light pierced the clouds, they struck. The Hessians, groggy and unprepared, were thrown into chaos as American soldiers stormed their positions with a relentless fervour. Muskets fired, smoke filled the air, and cries echoed through the streets of Trenton. Within an hour, the battle was over. Washington's forces had overwhelmed the enemy, capturing nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers while suffering minimal casualties. The victory was swift and decisive, and it electrified the American cause. The victory was so sudden, so complete, and so unexpected, remarked Colonel John Fitzgerald, capturing the astonishment and triumph of the day. The news of Trenton spread like wildfire, breathing new life into the Continental Army and the Revolution itself. Soldiers who had been on the verge of desertion were emboldened to stay. Recruits who had hesitated now stepped forward, inspired by the victory. Trenton was more than a military win. It was a profound morale boost. The sense of despair that had hung over the army for months began to lift, replaced by a renewed determination. The British had viewed the Continental Army as a force on the verge of collapse, but Trenton proved that Washington's men were far from defeated. They had shown resilience, courage, and an ability to surprise even the most seasoned adversaries. Washington understood the power of this moment. He knew that a single victory could turn the tides of war, and he wasn't about to let this momentum slip away. Emboldened by the success at Trenton, Washington set his sights on another target: the British garrison at Princeton. The stakes were high. Another victory could solidify the Americans' grip on New Jersey and push the British forces back toward New York. Just days after the triumph at Trenton, Washington and his men embarked on a daring march to Princeton, moving through the night to avoid detection. Exhaustion tugged at the soldiers' bones, but the spark of victory urged them onward. They were led by a man whose confidence seemed to expand with each step, a man who had proven that the impossible was indeed within reach. At dawn on January 3rd, 1777, Washington's forces reached Princeton and encountered British troops marching out from town. The battle was fierce, with both sides clashing in open fields as the sun crept higher into the winter sky. In a decisive moment, Washington rode to the front lines, rallying his troops and urging them to stand firm. His presence was electrifying, a reminder of his unshaken his courage sparking a renewed energy in his men. The Americans surged forward, pushing the British back in a furious exchange of musket fire and bayonet charges. By the time the dust settled, the British forces had been routed, their retreat hastened by the relentless advance of Washington's soldiers. The victory at Princeton was more than just another battlefield success. It was a strategic turning point. With the British pushed back toward New York, the Americans gained control over much of New Jersey, a critical area that allowed them to disrupt British movements and protect vital supply lines. For the British, it was a humiliating blow. General Howe, the British commander, would later describe the situation as a season of insurrection, rebellion, and almost of anarchy. The Americans had shown that they could hold their ground, even against a well-trained British army. Trenton and Princeton had not only shifted the course of the war, but had reshaped the very image of Washington's army. They were no longer a ragtag militia on the run. They were an organised force capable of striking back and winning. The impact of these twin victories was profound. Across the colonies, people heard of the triumphs at Trenton and Princeton and began to believe that the dream of independence might not be so far-fetched after all. Recruits poured into the Continental Army, eager to join the fight. Washington's daring gambits had captured the imagination of a fledgling nation, turning him into a symbol of resilience and defiance. His leadership had proven indispensable, his strategic brilliance clear for all to see. In a few short weeks, he had transformed a desperate situation into one filled with hope and possibility. But Washington understood that these victories, though crucial, would not be enough on their own. The British forces were still strong, their resources vast, and he knew that for the revolution to survive, they would need more than just battlefield success. With the Americans holding New Jersey, the struggle for independence had gained new momentum. Yet Washington recognized the importance of securing allies to support their cause. If they were to stand a chance against the might of the British Empire, they would need the backing of other nations, and so the seeds of diplomatic efforts began to take root. In 1776, the American Revolution was not only a fight against British forces, but also a fight for legitimacy. A fledgling nation, bound together by little more than shared grievances and the promise of liberty, needed allies if it was to survive against the greatest military power of the age. No one understood this better than Benjamin Franklin. The 70-year-old statesman was a master of diplomacy, armed with charm, wit, and a rare ability to turn the most reluctant of listeners into supporters. When he arrived in France in December 1776, Franklin was already somewhat of a celebrity, admired by the French for his intellect, his science, and perhaps more than anything, his humble American persona. With his plain dress and unpowdered hair, he played the role of the rustic philosopher perfectly, endearing himself to the French elite and captivating the public's imagination. Franklin's mission in France was clear: to win support for the American cause. But he didn't arrive in Paris with an army or a show of force. Instead, he wielded words as his weapon, skillfully navigating the salons of Paris, where aristocrats and intellectuals gathered to discuss politics, philosophy, and revolution. He knew that France's rivalry with Britain ran deep, and he worked to stoke the embers of that animosity, painting the American struggle as one that could weaken their old enemy. With every dinner invitation he accepted and every conversation he had, Franklin subtly sowed the seeds of French sympathy for America, casting the young nation's fight as one that aligned with France's own interests. Franklin's relationship with France's leaders was both delicate and complex. King Louis XVI, though wary of direct involvement in a colonial war, saw potential in the American cause. The young and energetic Foreign Minister, Charles Gravier, the Comte de Vergennes, was even more enthusiastic. Vergennes viewed the American conflict as a unique opportunity to cripple England and shift the balance of power in Europe. If we support America now, we cripple England, he reportedly remarked, seeing in the American Revolution a chance to avenge French losses from the 7 Years' War and reclaim France's prestige on the world stage. Franklin's persuasive charm and keen insight into European politics were proving indispensable. He was not simply an ambassador, but a bridge between two worlds, between an old monarchy and a new republic, united by mutual interests and a shared enemy. As Franklin worked to build connections with French leaders, his appeal spread among the French public as well. Parisians were fascinated by this American ambassador who defied the aristocratic norm, and Franklin became a symbol of the ideals of freedom and independence that resonated within French society. Writers and intellectuals saw in the American fight a reflection of their own desires for reform. The salons buzzed with talk of liberty, and French newspapers followed the events of the war with growing enthusiasm. Franklin's image, often depicted with his plain coat and humble demeanour, embodied the vision of a new world, inspiring support for the American cause, not just from the French elite, but from the people themselves. Yet, diplomacy was a careful dance. Franklin couldn't simply ask for troops and funds outright. He needed to demonstrate that the American cause was viable and worthy of investment. Reports of Washington's victories at Trenton and Princeton reached France at a critical moment, lending credibility to Franklin's appeals. These triumphs, he argued, were proof that the Americans were not only determined, but capable. France listened, and the first signs of support began to trickle in. The initial aid was subtle, conducted in shadows and whispers. France sent covert shipments of arms and funds to sustain the Continental Army, materials that kept the revolution alive during its most fragile stages. French ports quietly welcomed American ships, allowing them to trade and resupply, despite Britain's threats. This clandestine support was more than just a lifeline. It was a promise. It reassured Washington and the Continental Congress that they were not fighting alone. French gunpowder ignited American muskets, and French funds paid soldiers' wages, easing the burdens on an army stretched desperately thin. These covert acts of support hinted at a greater alliance yet to come. The French government, cautious of British retaliation, moved carefully, maintaining a thin veil of neutrality while subtly reinforcing American resistance. It was a balancing act, one that Franklin masterfully navigated, keeping hope alive with each shipment of supplies France's open commitment, a formal alliance that would not only provide military aid, but also signal to the world that America was a nation worth standing beside. Through endless discussions and strategic charm, Franklin built the foundation for what would soon become a full alliance, strengthening the ties between America and France, with each carefully chosen word and every shared ambition. The seeds he planted in the salons and courtrooms of Paris were beginning to bear fruit, and the world watched as France inched closer to taking an open stand. In February 1778, Franklin's efforts finally culminated in a breakthrough. The Treaty of Alliance was signed between the United States and France, marking a turning point in the Revolutionary War. For the first time, an established European power officially recognized American independence and agreed to support it with military force. French ships would soon cross the Atlantic, bringing seasoned troops and supplies, while French commanders, inspired by the promise of liberty, prepared to join the American fight. The alliance not only bolstered the Continental Army, but also forced Britain to divert resources as they now faced the threat of a global war. The tides of the revolution had shifted, and Franklin's work had set the stage for a new era in America's struggle for independence. This alliance, born of patience, charm, and determination, would prove crucial in the battles that lay ahead. Franklin's success in France was a testament to the power of diplomacy and the potential of alliances to change the course of history. America now had a partner, a powerful friend, willing to fight alongside them in the face of British dominance. As the alliance took shape, the Continental Army prepared to move forward with renewed vigour, knowing that a world beyond its borders was invested in its success. In August of 1776, the British Empire set its sights on New York, determined to break the spirit of the revolution by capturing this vital city. For General William Howe, New York wasn't just a city, it was a critical piece of the puzzle, a gateway that could split the colonies in half and crush the rebellion from within. As Howe saw it, New York was a key, a point of vital importance to the success of our cause. With control of the Hudson River, the British could sever communication and supply routes, weakening the colony's unity and cutting the revolution at its roots. Howe didn't come to New York lightly. He brought the full force of the British Empire with him. Over 32,000 well-trained soldiers, backed by a powerful navy, gathered in the harbour. It was an imposing display of Britain's might. I can only imagine how terrifying it must have been for the Continental Army, watching the redcoats and their ships fill the harbour, knowing they were about to face one of the world's most formidable forces. The British believed that this show of strength, combined with a quick capture of New York, would end the rebellion in one powerful blow. Across the battlefield, General George Washington was prepared to make a stand. Despite knowing his army was outnumbered and outgunned, he couldn't bear the thought of surrendering New York without a fight. His soldiers were mostly farmers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen, not professional soldiers, but they had a fire in them, a belief that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. Washington held his ground, positioning his troops around Brooklyn Heights, hoping that the terrain and his determination could somehow level the playing field. But when the Battle of Long Island unfolded, British showed just how powerful they were. Using a masterful flanking manoeuvre, Howe's forces surrounded Washington's troops, trapping them and inflicting heavy losses. The Continental Army was overwhelmed. I can picture Washington watching helplessly as his men, undertrained and outmatched, fell to the disciplined advance of British forces. Among those caught in the assault was General Sterling, who fought valiantly but couldn't hold against the British onslaught. It was a painful and humbling defeat, one that underscored the sheer might of the empire they were up against. Yet, amid the devastation, a miracle of sorts took place. As night fell, Washington made a daring decision. He would retreat under the cover of darkness, ferrying his army across the East River to avoid capture. Against all odds, a dense fog settled over the river, concealing their movements and allowing them to escape undetected. Row by row, soldiers crossed the water, slipping past the British in silence. Reflecting on the miraculous escape, Washington would later say, "The hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this. It was a close call, but one that breathed a bit of hope back into the weary troops." Despite the escape, Washington felt the sting of defeat. "I think the game is pretty near up," he admitted, a rare glimpse into the weight of his responsibility. It was clear how much he was sacrificing and how daunting the road ahead appeared. But even in despair, Washington's resolve remained. He knew he couldn't give up. Not now. Not with so much at stake. His resilience would be tested over and over, but his determination to keep fighting was unbreakable. With New York in British hands, the city transformed under occupation. British troops fortified their positions, turning New York into a military stronghold from which they launched raids and scouting missions. It wasn't just a city anymore. It was a fortified base, a constant threat to the surrounding colonies. For the British, New York became a critical hub, a place to organise and plan their next moves against the rebels. For those who stayed in New York, life under British control was harsh. Food became scarce. Homes were taken over, and anyone with suspected patriot sympathies lived in constant fear. Civilians faced harsh treatment, forced to choose between loyalty to the crown or allegiance to the revolutionary cause. New Yorkers were divided, with patriots and loyalists eyeing each other warily, each side seeing the other as a threat. Espionage flourished in the city's shadows, as both sides engaged in acts of sabotage and intelligence gathering. One of the most famous of these spies was Nathan Hale, a young teacher who volunteered to gather intelligence behind British lines. He was captured and executed, and his final words, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country," became a rallying cry for the patriot cause. Even as the British settled into their stronghold, Washington was regrouping. The loss of New York was a bitter blow, but he knew this fight was far from over. The Continental Army would need to endure many hardships and sacrifices in the months to come. The fall of New York was just one battle, and Washington was determined that it wouldn't define the outcome of the war. In the next episode, we'll explore the turning points of the Revolutionary War, the pivotal moments of courage and resilience that would eventually reshape the fate of the colonies. I hope you'll join me as we continue this journey through history, tracing tracing the steps of those who fought, persevered,